So welcome, good morning, Happy New Year, and welcome to our first adult education event for 2021, our fourth for the 2020-2021 fiscal year, Conversations with Congregants. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you, my name is Ann Katz, and I have the honor of being the chair of adult education. Our year-long theme is healing through Jewish values. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank the Adult Education Committee and especially Rabbi Arberman, Cantor Ben-Simon, our fearless leader, Len Schwartz, Fern Shalero, Linda Fain, Brenda Kabler, Elaine Fleischer, Carol Summers, and Marcy Marcus. I want to give a special shout out to Bobby Sadow, who has tirelessly put all the materials together to promote these programs, as well as being our Zoom master, so we can bring them to you. Please visit Temple Beth David's website for adult education and Scholar in Residence programming. And our Scholar in Residence is Rabbi Deborah Eisenman. Temple Beth David has many congregants with varied backgrounds and fascinating talents. Our first three programs focused on tools for navigating periods of uncertainty, utilizing the expertise of three of our temple's members who are psychologists. Today's program takes us on a different journey through a personal account of Jewish history. Our speaker for this morning has a career spanning 50 years of service to the American Jewish community and the not-for-profit sector. As a pulpit rabbi, he served congregations in Galveston, Texas, Allentown, Pennsylvania, and part-time in Baltimore, Maryland through 2008. In his non-pulpit career, he served in senior management fundraising positions with national Jewish organizations, culminating in the founding of his fundraising consulting firm, the Aleph Group, in 1996. In recent years, he has raised more than $30 million. For a dozen years, he served as part-time executive director of the Baltimore Board of Rabbis. His passion for travel has taken him to nearly 50 countries, including 27 trips to Israel. He holds 6 degrees from Columbia University, New York University, and the Jewish Theological Seminary, including an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree from the latter institution. His wife of 50 years recently retired from private practice in family therapy. They have 3 married sons and 8 grandchildren. It is my honor and delight to welcome Rabbi Michael Meyerstein for his presentation on letters to my father. Just one note, if you have any questions, please either write them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen or hold them to the end of the presentation when you'll have plenty of time to ask them. Michael?
Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for tuning in. I'd like to share with you this morning that I'm going to be telling you a very personal story that's been many decades in the making. It's a story about my father in particular, but also indirectly about my mother as well, because both of them lived through the traumatic separation from their parents, and equally important, the emerging trauma of living in a country once governed by a representative democracy that was seized by an ambitious mad dog authoritarian and who wreaked havoc not only on his own country, but the entire world. They watched Hitler's power grab, enabled by underlings so mesmerized by his rhetoric, so taken in by his charisma, so drawn into becoming cult-like followers, so willing to do his bidding and so fearful of disobeying, criticizing, standing up, and rebuking his leadership. In a perverted sort of way, I'm glad my parents are not alive today. They would have been re-traumatized by those protesters, AKA insurrectionists, extremists, bearing anti-Semitic symbols of hatred. And I guarantee you they would be viewing the images of the last few days through a much different lens. Those images would evoke haunting memories of being eyewitnesses to Hitler's attacks on the pillars of democracy, his dehumanization of segments of society, his fomenting of civil unrest, the inculcation of distrust, the dismantling of free press and its replacement with a propaganda machine that daily disseminated lies, hoaxes, and conspiracy theories. They witnessed how legislators, the judiciary, and the military were co-opted into becoming willing accomplices in the creation of an uncontrollable and uncontainable monster capable of murdering 6 million Jews and untold millions of other human beings, as well as all in the name of loyalty and servitude to one man and one party. That said, perhaps you'll understand why I viewed the horrific events of Wednesday, indeed the last 4 years, very differently than most Americans, especially Trump's enablers, allies, supporters, and donors, because of what I experienced growing up in my parents' house. No, thank God I'm not at all suggesting that conditions in America are anything like those of Germany in the 30s and 40s. I would like to propose, however, that perhaps we dare to consider and judge last week's events as a cautionary tale. My program today is dedicated to the lasting memory of the grandparents I never knew. It's the outgrowth of my finding a box of letters carefully preserved by my father for 67 years that chronicle his parents' lives prior to their deportation to Minsk and their subsequent murder by ordinary citizens seduced into committing extraordinary evil, all in obedience to one man. So let's begin, and let me start off by pulling up my PowerPoint, which suddenly escaped. Bear with me one moment.
Wait, is it up higher? Huh?
I've entitled this presentation, Until We Meet Again. I do so because my parents left, escaped, fled Germany, thinking that they would once again be reunited with their parents, but that never came to pass. And the fact that they escaped under those circumstances left them with guilt their entire lives, guilt that they were never able to resolve. And they went to their deaths with the guilt that they should have done more, could have done more, even though it was all against all odds during wartime. So I share this program with you and want to make mention of the fact that the letters that I alluded to and will be speaking more about shortly were translated by a person who has now become a very beautiful, warm friend of mine, Jutta Allers. Martin Niemöller, a Lutheran minister and early Nazi supporter, was later imprisoned for opposing Hitler's regime. And this is what he wrote. And I'm sure many, if not most of you, are familiar with these words. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. This morning, we will review, discuss some of the 400 anti-Jewish laws that were enacted that led to the Kristallnacht and subsequent to Kristallnacht. We'll have a look at what Kristallnacht was and understand how that became the impetus for my grandparents' urgent search to leave Germany. I'll then share with you my family's Shoah story as told in photos and letters. And then the events that took place in Germany during my grandparents' last days. November the 7th, 1941 being the date of the last letter they penned and sent to my father, which he didn't receive until the end of January. And then I'll share with you my father's 60-year plus efforts to locate his parents and seek justice on their behalf. And then some closing thoughts, including my family's answers to Hitler. So let's understand a little bit about the background, about how Hitler was able to enact all of these anti-Jewish policies. He did so by blaming, denigrating, marginalizing outsiders. And the Jews were deemed as outsiders, despite the fact that Jews lived in Germany for hundreds upon hundreds of years prior to the 20th century. Hitler promoted himself as the only one who was in tune with the sentiments of the people, and the only person who could, as a strong figure, could solve Germany's social economic problems, the problems that were the result of the end of World War I, when Germany suffered a humiliating defeat and left it in absolute economic ruins. And he projected himself as the only one who could right the wrongs that democratic institutions couldn't. He also capitalized on the gap between the rich and the working poor. He fostered distrust of the elite as ones who devalued just ordinary people on the streets and only looked after their own self-interests. And little by little, he introduced laws restricting citizens' freedoms, read that as Jews' freedoms, and he attacked and ultimately eliminated the free press and co-opted the judiciary. So it all began in 1933 when he took power. And here we learn, as I mentioned a moment ago, there were some 400 decrees, regulations restricting all aspects of Jews' public and private lives. And the ultimate goal, as you will deduce as you see some of these laws, was to isolate Jews, isolate them economically, socially, and ultimately disenfranchise them legally from German society. The result of these laws, in part, was that by 1939, only 16% of Jewish households had steady incomes of any kind. So parenthetically, let me point out, excuse me, that my grandfather was a merchant in semi-precious and precious stones. And as a result of one of the laws that we'll speak about in a moment, he was reduced, he and my grandmother were reduced to instant poverty. So he and she were among the 84% of the Jewish households that didn't have any steady income of any kind. There were thousands of Jews who remained interned in concentration camps following Kristallnacht, including my uncle. And there is a story which perhaps I can share at some other time, how the University of Saxony, which is a region of Germany, contacted me a number of years ago to say that they believe they found a textbook, a high school textbook that once belonged to my uncle, but more about that some other time. So here are some of the laws from 1933-36. The principal one being that the enabling act now allowed Hitler to enact laws without any kind of parliamentary approval. And as a result of his usurpation of power, he removed Jews from civil service jobs, denied them admission to the bar, banned them from editorial posts. Jewish students were now capped. The number of students entering public schools and universities was capped. Citizenship revoked of naturalized Jews, the so-called undesirables. Kosher slaughter of animals banned, Jewish property and books attacked and burned, culminating in the infamous Kristallnacht, when hundreds upon hundreds of synagogues were ransacked and burnt to the ground, and when tens of thousands of books were burnt. No longer could Jews feel protected by the police, courts. The public was told to boycott Jewish-owned firms, and the infamous Department of Racial Hygiene was established. But notice that the pattern that begins here in the from 33 to 36 was to strip away a Jew's ability to become or to remain self-sufficient economically, and to begin to remove students from public schools and denying them access to an education, which in turn would deny them further and future employment. Jewish students excluded from the military, excluded from taking exams in medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, and laws. The Nuremberg race laws, 1935, were the ones responsible for denying basic civil rights. Jews were excluded from Reich citizenship. They no longer could marry or have sexual relations with persons of German or German-related blood, could no longer vote, denied overseas passports, and the social isolation that came from being banned from parks, restaurants, pools, and denied the ability to buy electrical, optical equipment, such as bikes, typewriters, records, forbidden to change names of businesses, and the third bullet point being rather important because Jews were now required to give an inventory of all their property in excess of 5,000 RM, which was the denomination of their currency at the time. And why is this important? Because ultimately this would be used as a way of seizing their property, as a way of reducing them to poverty, as a way of financing Hitler's war. And part of the continued isolation of Jews, marginalization from society, their exclusion from participating at spas, movies, theaters, concerts, and so on. Something also important to note, and I'll have a visual to show you in a few moments, Jews had to add the names of Sarah or Israel to their own names, drawing attention to their Jewishness. Their passports were marked as invalid. They had to surrender them, and immediately afterwards they were revalidated, but the letter J was stamped on them. And again, I'll have a visual to share with you. Jewish-owned businesses closed, Jewish children expelled finally. And here's the visual that I spoke of. This is a sample page from what I believe to have been my great-grandmother's sister. As you can see on the left-hand side, this is the letter J for a Jew. And if you read very carefully, I wasn't able to blow it up sufficiently, but the middle name says Sarah. In 1939, this is already after Kristallnacht, Jews had to surrender all precious metals, stones to the state without compensation. So my grandfather, having been a dealer, a merchant in precious and semi-precious stones, that was his source of income. And giving that up immediately, as I said, reduced him and his wife to instant poverty. Jews were evicted from their homes without any reason or notice. Curfews established for Jews, radios confiscated, so they could no longer be au courant, as it were, with what was going on around them. Phones confiscated. They now had to wear that infamous Star of David, couldn't use public phones, and forbidden to leave the country. So let's take a look at Kristallnacht, November 9th to 10th, 1938.
When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, he quickly began enacting anti-Jewish laws. He had long blamed the Jews for Germany's defeat in World War I and the subsequent years of hardship. To Hitler, they were the enemy that threatened his dream of supreme German nationalism. By 1935, Jews were stripped of German citizenship, refused education. Their businesses were openly boycotted by the Nazi Party. Storefronts branded with the Star of David to prevent patronage. They were effectively outcast. Hundreds of thousands fled.
The plight of Jewish children driven from Germany has stirred the sympathy and conscience of the rest of the world. Here is the first group arriving at Harwich.
But soon,
Whoops.
when Adolf Hitler was appointed
Sorry.
Chancellor, refused education. Their businesses were openly boycotted by the Nazi Party. Storefronts branded with the Star of David to prevent
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
Suddenly my computer shut down. So
Okay.
let me quickly get my notes and we'll resort to plan B. All right.
Use my computer.
So I'm sorry, just bear with me one moment.
Just crashed.
Well, the good and the bad of technology, right?
Right? It's okay. Hold on.
I'm so sorry. We went through a dry run and everything worked perfectly, but then suddenly on my screen, it said there was an error and the computer had to shut down for some unexplained reason, but nonetheless, we will not be daunted. So the video, unfortunately, which I can't share with you at the moment, but I'm happy to look for the link and send it to Bobby so that it can be included on the website sometime in the near future. The video showed the images, which I'm sure many of you have seen over the years of the destruction that came in the wake of Kristallnacht. And I would share with you something that might happen to my father in the 90s when he had received the second or third invitation from the German government, and specifically the city of Dusseldorf, to come and visit. My father, who surprised me by his willingness to go back to Germany, given all of the memories that he had, did so very willingly because in his mind he wanted to milk the Germans for every last penny he could. And if they were offering him a complimentary trip, all expenses paid, he was going to take advantage of it. So on this particular trip, he had erected two Stolpersteins. A Stolperstein in German means a stumbling block, and the video or the PowerPoint that I would have shown you had pictures of the Stolpersteins. These are brass plaques originally conceived of and designed by a non-Jewish German artist who in the early 90s wanted to pay homage and tribute to German Jews who were victims of the Holocaust. And the plaque, as it was designed, is rather simple. It contains the name of the victim, the dates when they were born, and if known, when they were killed, where they were killed, and how. And then these plaques are installed in the sidewalk outside of the residence where that victim last lived. And sometimes they are also erected on the wall leading into the entrance of the building. Since the early 90s, this artist, Demnik, name will come to me, has installed over 60,000 such plaques in a dozen countries, 7,000 of which are in Berlin alone. So my father was in Dusseldorf on the occasion of erecting these plaques for his parents, and it garnered some publicity. The mayor was there at the dedication and so on and so forth. A story appeared in a couple of newspapers with a picture of him. And as a result, there were 3 people who called into City Hall to want to get in touch with my father. Why? They were high school classmates of my father, and they remembered him, they remembered his name. My father expressed an interest in meeting them. They went out to lunch, and in the course of the conversation, as he related to me, he very casually, calmly, innocently asked each one of them, who at that time, by that time, were in their late 70s, asked them, well, where were you during the war? And each one responded with a different answer. I was imprisoned, I was fighting on the front, I was nowhere near Germany, in other words, and I had no complicity in the murder of Jews. My father knew for a fact that one of those people was the son of a man who stormed into my parents' apartment November 9th, 1938, together with other SS troopers, and utterly destroyed their apartment, throwing their furniture out the windows, smashing anything and everything in sight. So my father apparently kept his cool, kept his calm, and didn't make reference to that episode. But he did share with me that after the passage of the Nuremberg laws in 1935, the day after, when he went to school, he was totally ignored by his closest friends. It would not even acknowledge his presence and just walked by him as if he didn't exist, as if he was a Casper the Ghost, as it were. And so this was his memorable trip, as it were, to Germany. And some things you never forget. And certainly being a teenager at that time, that was a memory Kristallnacht seared into his memory. Let me have one moment to ask my wife to see what's going on in my office with my computer. Maybe it restarted. If not, we'll continue as planned. You would have seen an image of the synagogue in Düsseldorf, the grandeur of that synagogue, solid stone, and the majesty of the sanctuary, huge sanctuary, pipe organ, just beautiful to behold. And then another picture showing that same synagogue totally destroyed and sacked by the rioters after Kristallnacht. I would have shown you photos of my grandparents, photo of my father in 10th grade in a classroom photo, and then a picture of his home that I visited, just seeing it from the outside in 1966. And then I wanted to make mention of the fact that this home was, and it's still standing today, situated across from the Rhine River. And as you know, the mantra in real estate, and especially here in Florida, location, location, location. So my parents, my grandparents rather, lived a very comfortable lifestyle. They were probably upper middle class citizens in Germany. One moment, please. So, So the next visual that I would have shown is a page, one page of 400 pages of handwritten letters that my grandparents wrote to my father. My father left Germany on April the 27th, 1939, very, very late for someone to escape Germany at that time. The last letter was written November 7th, 1941, just 3 days before they were deported to Minsk and to their ultimate death. A second visual, well, let me just one more note about the letter itself, that it was written on onion skin paper. In those days, just like today, to mail a letter, the fees are measured by the weight of the letter. And so onion skin being very, very light meant that the cost would be much cheaper than sending it on regular paper. The next visual would have shown an envelope, a torn envelope that had been opened by the censors because nothing could be written in letters, especially letters going outside of Germany, that would not be opened by the censors. And so people were extremely guarded in what they said and how they said it. Now, I mentioned that April 27th, 39 was a very late date for leaving Germany. And to the day of his death, my father never knew who managed to secure exit papers for him, who managed to secure an affidavit for him to leave. But he was urged to do so by his parents. He was the only son, only child, and he was urged to leave out of fear for his safety had he remained in Germany. And in retrospect, I have to give my grandparents a lot of credit. A lot of credit for being courageous, a lot of credit for thinking and planning ahead, a lot of credit at the sacrifice that they made by agreeing to my father leaving, albeit under these very difficult and unusual circumstances. Just one moment, please. Okay, I believe we might be able to resume from my computer, so bear with me for one moment, and let's hope that we can continue with the visuals. Are we reconnected? Can you still hear me? Right, would you tell them that I have to reconnect to Zoom?
Yeah, Anne? Anne?
Yes, I'm here.
Michael has to reconnect to Zoom. I just opened the PowerPoint for him, but he has to reconnect to
Okay.
Zoom.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us. Even without visuals, this is a really fascinating presentation. And we can all learn from Michael how to be flexible.
Are you okay? Can, Anne or Bobby, can you let Michael in again? He's logged on to the Zoom meeting.
Can you hear me now?
You're there. You're there.
I apologize. This certainly wasn't part of the rehearsal. So let me bring up the presentation again, and we'll resume as if nothing happened. This is an image of my two grandparents, paternal grandparents, Alfred and Meta Meyerstein. This is a photo.
You have to share your screen again.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on just a second. All right. Yeah, just a second. Previous slide. I understand, yeah.
Green button at the bottom, share screen.
Yeah.
We can see it. Just go to the slide, hit slideshow in the PowerPoint
Okay,
from current slide.
right, okay. Slide
Right here on top.
slideshow.
Yeah.
It's already there and comes from current slide.
Now can you see it?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, so let me go back to the slide that showed you a picture of my grandparents, Alfred and Meta Meyerstein. This is my grandparents with my father when he was perhaps 9 or 10 years of age. This is a high school photo, perhaps around 10th grade. My grandfather is to the far left, towards the back, wearing a vest and glasses, sitting just to the right of a student identified as Theodore. This is the photo of the home that my grandparents lived until they were deported. In the last year or two of their lives, while they were still in this home, because they had been reduced to poverty, they resorted to renting out their rooms to Jews who had been evicted from their own homes and had no place to go, and who were awaiting what would ultimately become their own deportation. So let me show you now. This is the page of one of the 400 pages, handwritten, old script German. And very few people know how to read this old script. I was lucky enough to find Uta, a German herself, about my age, whose life story is very interesting. It was only when she was age 20 did her parents disclose to her their involvement with the Nazis. And they managed to keep it a secret from her until that time. It had quite an impact on her, and it was a lifelong impact indeed. She now does volunteer work for the Holocaust Museum in Washington. Here's the envelope I referred to, the torn envelope opened by censors, sent to my father in London. Now, I began to say that my father never really knew who was responsible for allowing him to escape. And the securing of an affidavit became one of the central themes of my grandparents' letters. It was so important and urgent that they have that piece of paper that would give them an escape route, an exit route out of Germany. And they went through hoops to try to secure an affidavit and to secure visas. There were conversations in the letters between them and my father as to what countries they should investigate that might allow them in. And in the course of writing, they mentioned Chile and Venezuela, Shanghai, England, US, Cuba, Bolivia, Australia. They discussed the pros and the cons of each one of those countries as if they had the luxury of choosing. Now, I'm going to pause for one moment and bear with me. You're seeing a screen share of my text, aren't you? Yes, no? What you don't, what are
Yes,
you?
we're seeing the screen share of your PowerPoint.
Okay, that's fine. So what I'd wanted to continue in telling you was that in their strategizing about some kind of an exit route from Germany, their thoughts were that once they would arrive safely and the country of choice was England, because that's where my father was living during the war. The country of choice was England, and the strategy was that, at least as revealed in the letter by mid-July of 39, my grandmother wrote that she should be so lucky to get out, but in anticipation of doing so, she's going to have to dye her hair. Why? Because it was all white, and for employment purposes and for emigration purposes, she wanted to appear as youthful as possible. And because she was concerned about how they were going to manage their lives economically in England. And this, of course, was in July of 39, before the outbreak of the war. In September, she realized that because my grandfather had suffered from ill health, and my father was reduced to working in a factory. Remember, he had been kicked out of high school at 10th grade, and he had no skills other than some training and certification that he got in machine tooling. So my grandmother assumed that she would be the principal breadwinner. And so she trained to become a domestic for larger families in England. She had to learn how to clean, cook, learn how to bake. She took formal classes because living the upper middle class life that they did, they always had a domestic living in the house. And so she never had to do any of these tasks. And suddenly, in her early 50s, she was having to learn how to do things as elementary as cleaning, cooking, baking, and sewing, and learning how to become a milliner. And related to their strategy about securing a visa and affidavit, and trying to look younger for employment purposes, she deliberately dressed appropriately for a much, much younger person for the photos that would be used for affidavits. My grandmother encouraged my father to save every shilling he could because, as she said, it would be the foundation for their guarantee together once my grandmother and grandfather would arrive in England. Now, bear in mind that my father in 1939, at the time of this letter, had just turned 19. And he was lucky enough to secure a job repairing tanks. And his pay was all of 30 shillings a week, 25 of which went to room and board. And yet, with additional expenses, his mother expected him to be able to save money that would be able to sustain the three of them once they would have arrived in England. Another theme that came from the letters was the constant reassurance to my father how much they loved him, how much they missed him, how much they hoped for a reunion that would keep them going. And then the line that got repeated so many times over, and you talk about how Jewish mothers and fathers are able to put their children on guilt trips. The one line that has always gotten to me is, "You are our one and only hope." And if you think about how unrealistic the expectation was, and I understand what prompted that unrealistic expectation. Here's my father. English is a second language to him. He's living in a town called Ware, about 40 miles outside of London. And he's working under very difficult circumstances, the war very imminent. And he's given the message that we're dependent on you to get us out of here. If I sound a little bit emotional, that's usually what happens when I start talking about this part of my my life growing up with my parents while I was a child. So from the letters, from these 400 pages, I learned a lot about my grandparents as people and their personalities. My grandparents expressed concerns about their only child's day-to-day life, as evidenced by the questions that they asked. What can we send you? Now, of course, this was written early in my father being in England, the months of May, June, July, when they could still afford to and could still send him material things. And so they shipped him a bike, believe it or not, radio, and food from Düsseldorf to England. They even, my grandmother even proposed that he send his laundry home once every 8 weeks for her to do. A major topic. And then she wondered if he would have to pay the duty on the laundry coming back into England. So then she said, well, maybe send it to someone else locally once every 3 weeks. Now, also, I have to say that it was very difficult for my father to find room and board that he could afford. And that came out in the way my grandparents replied to him. They urged him to find a roommate to share expenses. My grandmother even suggested that he negotiate with his landlady such that if he were to go to London for a weekend, which he sometimes did in search of Jewish girls, that he should negotiate with her and get credit for the uneaten meals while he was away. And at least once, as evidenced by the reply from my grandmother, because remember, none of the letters that my father wrote back to his parents, none of those letters exist. But it was very apparent that at least once my father lost his lease and he was homeless with just 2 pence to his name. They worried about him living in a room without light. He used candles and flashlights, especially difficult in winter with long nights. And she warned him that candlelight's not good for your eyes. At least a gas light is preferable. On a practical level, they urged my father to look up friends and family, quote unquote, already in England, thinking that by reaching out to them, perhaps they could offer some resources to help rescue my grandparents with affidavits, sponsorships, perhaps offer my father meals, clothing, jobs, documents. And they were always asking him how he's managing his money. I can't imagine. It was a very lengthy reply. If 80% of his salary every week went for room and board, I'm not sure what was left to manage, but nonetheless, urging him to open a postal savings account so that he could save something from his salary. They were concerned about his loneliness. I mentioned that once in a while he traveled from Ware to London to meet Jewish girls, because quite frankly, in the city of Ware, which today has a population of 18,000, at that time there were only a handful of Jews. As fate would have it, one of them would ultimately turn out to be my mother. But in that same context, my grandmother would offer, and my grandfather would offer advice about romance, about dating. My grandmother especially being somewhat concerned about my father's interest in a woman 8 years his senior. That woman turned out to be my mother. So in one of the letters, it became apparent, at least in the minds of my grandparents, that my father was looking for a relationship with girls ostensibly as a way to get his socks darned. But I won't say any more about that. They even recommended to him that he turn to a local priest, to a storekeeper or a neighbor, in the hope that they might know of some other Jews in town with whom he could socialize. So in reading through these 400 pages, what comes out is a lot of advice about work, romance, health, and life. My grandmother reminds him of the importance of learning English for his advancement, and so he went to night school for English and a trade, because after all, he was a bachelor and he had to take care of himself. And as a good Jewish mother, she constantly reminded him about manners, remaining a good boy, being polite, saying thank you, keeping in touch, and especially cautioning him to be careful at work. Why? Because he was an alien and he was distrusted by the English, not necessarily because he was Jewish, but because he was German. And isn't that the story of Jewish history and the Jewish people? That wherever we were, there was always suspicions about our loyalty and our patriotism to the country in which we lived. Now, there were other interesting observations about my grandparents that came out from the letters. And just bear with me one moment while I escape from this presentation so you can see. Presently, are you seeing the PowerPoint or are you seeing me? Both.
Oh,
All right. And
you're
as
seeing the candles.
okay, and as I'm talking, do you see me talking?
Yes.
Okay, good. So another interesting observation I made in reading the letters from my grandparents is a certain religious sensibility. What do I mean by that? Language such as, dear God, hopefully prayers, the belief that God would bring them to safety and reunite them with their only child. Street smarts. What do I mean by street smarts? Reach out to the rabbi or his wife, people with connections who can do more than us poor folks. My grandfather had a sense of humor, shared stories, self-deprecating, reflected on his own childhood, his relationships with girls. My grandmother also had a sense of humor. She wanted to be able to be reunited with her son because, and this goes back to another comment I made a moment ago, she can do a better job at darning socks and keeping clothes in order than any girlfriend. So that was her motivation to be reunited with my father. But unfortunately, the tone of the letters changed with the passage of time and probably reflected the gradual deterioration of their living conditions. There were alternating moods. My grandmother began to openly express some down feelings, and you have to appreciate the fact that expressing down feelings really was like a double-edged sword, because she feared that sharing down feelings might affect my father's emotional well-being. And she had to keep his spirits up because they were dependent on him to get them out. By mid-July of '39, she wrote that she might not need English after all, meaning if we don't get out. And so she cut back on her nighttime study. In another letter, she wrote, maybe, God willing, we will meet again someday. The first time that there was some hint of doubt that they would ever get out. Yet all three of them, my grandparents and my father, realized their interdependence on each other and the need to keep each other's spirits up while they were in this precarious situation. My grandmother reprimanded my father for complaining about the little things and the impact that it has on her emotional state. In August of '39, my father received something that would, what shall I say, determine a certain path that he chose to take for the next 60 years of his life. What he received in the mail was a postcard, innocent postcard. And all that it said was, in translated, everything is in order with Allianz. Perhaps you've heard of Allianz. It's a global insurance company. Perhaps you even bought insurance, travel insurance from Allianz. Well, this insurance company held two policies, or I should say, my grandparents held two policies with the company that were purchased in 1920. The only other thing that was written on the postcard were the two policy numbers. Based on that information, my father then pursued justice in the name of his parents for the decades to come, concluding 1 year before his death. And I'll share with you about that. The end of August, the repeat of the words to my father, "You seem to be very nervous. Don't be nervous, don't despair." And she began sharing with him her observation about changes in my father's maturation, his new sense of seriousness, no longer being lighthearted as he used to be. Several long several long letters on that subject alone. The worsening conditions that my grandparents endured is evidence nominally from their somewhat coded letters, because after all, they had to escape censors' suspicions, but sometimes they were quite transparent, as in when my grandparent wrote about these turbulent times. And what further came out in these letters was talk about money and their material well-being. Money was so tight, she wrote, that once she broke her tooth, she worried about the cost of getting it fixed because they no longer had insurance. They sold their furniture in their apartment because they needed food to be able to put on the table. But as you well know, that in a bad market, prices are depressed when everyone else is trying to sell and to liquidate, to raise cash. And they were concerned whether they could sell off enough belongings to be able to get cash for food, goods, supplies, the cost of visa documents. They sold my father's suit, his records, even tried to sell his stamp collection, but they learned that it was nothing of value. My grandfather's health had improved slightly, and that was important because the Nazis hinted that the elderly and the ill would suffer adverse discrimination. In the letters came out all sorts of information about their social life. They lamented how their Jewish community in Dusseldorf was emptying out of family and friends. They felt abandoned, they felt loneliness, they felt despair. Emptying out because either there were people who were lucky enough to get affidavits and leave the country, or unfortunately emptying out because people were being deported to their deaths. My grandmother especially wrote my father every little detail to keep him in the loop about their family and friends, who was marrying and leaving and stopping by for coffee and cake. Lots of names were cited in the letters and details about those people's lives, their emigration status. There was mention of their own sense of loneliness in April of 1940 when they were celebrating Pesach Seder without friends, because the prior year, my father, just weeks before his flight from Germany, had celebrated Pesach with them. They talked about employment, jobs. My grandmother hoped that her husband could find work, even though Jews had been dismissed and fired from their jobs, could find work as a distraction for him and for her so that she wouldn't worry so much about him and their plight and speculating about their future. There was really no work for Jews at that time. My grandfather went door to door, but unsuccessfully to find work. And then finally he found a job in a slate roof tile factory. And it was a job that required him in poor health, in his mid to late 50s by that time, schlepping, I believe the letter said, some 2,500 heavy slate tiles every day from one place in the factory to another. And the new restrictions that were imposed on German Jewish life every day impacted personally on my grandparents, as everyone else. And then there was a note that a friend in the States by the name of Lottie Liebergal had written to them. We had news November the, I'm sorry, this was a note that my father had received a number of years after the war. We had news November the 10th from my sister. We are very afraid for all the loved ones who are still there in Europe. So that was a little bit about what was revealed in the letters. And let me just talk about the last aspects of this journey through the letters. My grandparents were deported on November the 10th. And what we learned about these train rides, the infamous train rides for Jews going to these death camps, was amazing, because the Germans were known for their meticulous note-taking and record-keeping. So my grandparents were on train number 52, leaving from Düsseldorf to Minsk. They had received their evacuation order 3 days earlier, as evidenced by the last letter that my father had received from them. And a total of almost 5,900 Jews were deported from Düsseldorf to Minsk from November the 10th, 41 through the summer of 42. They were allowed one suitcase, but their assets were seized according to the inventory that they had already submitted to the authorities long ago, including all the details about bank accounts and securities, insurance, properties. So the Germans knew very well if the people boarding these trains were taking things with them illegally. My grandparents, together with 990 other Jews, were packed into cattle cars. They traveled for 96 hours in sub-zero temperatures without food or water. The lucky ones died on the train before reaching their destination, and others, including my grandparents, were forced into the infamous Minsk ghetto, where they were ultimately murdered. The date of that murder has yet to be discovered in documents. An eighth of the people in Minsk died of malnutrition and diseases. The remaining 40 to 60,000 were gassed. I talked about the postcard. The postcard that had information about 2 insurance policies that my grandparents purchased in 1920, now 100 years ago. And bear in mind, because they were people of the upper middle class, it stands to reason that they would buy an insurance policy with a face value commensurate with their lifestyle. I share that with you for a reason, which I'll disclose momentarily. Once my father got to America, we came to the States in December of 47. He hired top German lawyers including Robert Kempner Jr., who was a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. Kempner lived in Lansdowne, Pennsylvania, part-time and part-time in Germany. Lansdowne was outside of Philadelphia where my parents lived. And for 50 years plus, they demanded that Allianz own up to their responsibility to make payment of the claims for the insurance policy. So what happened during those 50 years, I'm sure has been written about in textbooks, how Allianz tried to avoid and evade paying out on those policies. All sorts of excuses were given. Oh, the warehouse where those policies were housed burned to the ground. Oh, there's no trace of those insurance policies ever having been purchased. We have no record of those numbers. And the ultimate insult came in one letter when Allianz said, well, the policies lapsed in 1941 for lack of payment, absence of payment. Well, what do you expect if, anyway. So in May of 2005, my oldest son, Avi, who's a lawyer, was just finishing law school at Georgetown. And in the months leading up to his graduation, not only did he have to deal with his studies, but he took on the job of preparing to represent my father in a courtroom situation to represent my father in his claim against Allianz. And so in May of 2005, my father's day in court finally arrived. The scene was in Washington, D.C., in an office big enough to have a conference table, and my wife, my three sons, Avi's wife, and the judge. The judge was an international juror by the name of Gaffney from Philadelphia. The proceedings were broadcast to London Live, and this was all part of the International Commission on Holocaust-era Insurance Claims. They heard the case, the judge heard the case, and after an hour of testimony during which I sobbed like a child, I just could not contain myself because I heard my father retell his story in his own words, sitting there in the chair stoically. And at the end of the hour, we're walking out of the office. The judge says to us, I want you to know that your claim against Allianz is absolutely justified. But I have to tell you already now that it will be a token payment. Token payment because he said, we have thousands upon thousands of other claims to settle. And this is for people who, my father was almost 85 when he got the settlement, and they paid him $2,000 per policy. This after a policy had been bought 100 years ago. But that was, for my father, a Pyrrhic victory. What was more important is that he was able to pursue justice, tzedek tirdof, and he did so in a way that finally brought him peace and solace. Here you see a letter from the International Red Cross, the British Red Cross Society, written in November of '43, 2 years after they had been deported, and they share with him that they have no information yet to share about his parents. Some closing thoughts. Professor Emil Fackenheim from Canada once wrote these memorable lines. The 11th commandment, thou shalt not give Hitler a posthumous victory. Here are my parents, Ralph and Cicely, married 57 years. They lived their lives with courage, hope, optimism, and accordance with Fackenheim's 11th commandment, as evidenced by the legacy they left behind. And this is my family's defiant answer to Hitler. Their son, my wife Israela, family therapist, educator, my son Avi, lawyer and founder and president of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, which just got the good news that Congress approved $250 million for the initiative that Avi started almost 17 years ago. His wife Dana, an entrepreneur, founder and president of Dana Designs. Their 3 children, my son Ariel, who I believe is on this call, a lawyer, PhD in law, serving as VP for global policy and human rights, and so on and so forth with Citigroup, active with New Israel Fund, and his wife, also a lawyer, director of customer experience at Wolters Kluwer, a global firm, and their 1 son and 1 daughter. And finally, my youngest son, Sha'anan, a pediatrician, lieutenant commander in the public health service, volunteer on global medical missions. His wife, Rachel, nutritionist in private practice, and their 2 daughters and 1 son. And this is a picture absent the 2 children who were born after the picture. Picture of my 3 sons, their wives, and 6 of the 8 grandchildren. In the absence of physical grave markers, these Stolperstein plaques installed on the pavement outside of 15 Rathshofer Street, Strasse, Düsseldorf, remind passersby of my grandparents' last home before their tragic deaths at the hands of a previous generation of cold-blooded German murderers. And these are the brass plaques that I spoke about. The name of my grandparents, their birth dates, my grandfather 1884, my grandmother 1888, deported 1941, died in Minsk. Tehi nishmatam su Rabbi Tzura Chaim. May their memories forever be for a blessing. Thank you very much. I'm very sorry about the disruption to the program, but we got through it with enough time for some questions and answers, should there be any.
Thank you so much, Michael, for not only being flexible and unflappable with the challenge of technology. It was such a heart-rendering presentation. It was just beautiful. Thank you so much. Does anybody have questions?
Yes, is there a way we could see, all we have is a candle right now.
What would you like to see?
I mean, could we go back to the regular screen where we're not?
I'm not okay, just a moment.
I guess
You mean to see Michael? So see Mike?
No, we're back. Yes, I have something to say. Michael, that was an amazing presentation, amazing and heartwarming. And I sat there gripping my pad because I wrote down a couple of things to ask you. I'm not going to take too long, but I'm a Holocaust survivor child from Hungary. And my parents were Holocaust survivors. My grandparents were taken when they came into Hungary and took them, and they went to their death, their whole family, 7 children there was. And my father got out because at 18, he was a soldier in the Hungarian army. At 19, they plucked out all the Jews and threw them into forced labor camp. 5 years of labor camp in the Ukraine. My mother was just like in the, where they lived off of the star, doing anything they could to survive. They lived in the woods. And my mother had rickets, the whole thing. They survived. And then, of course, the communists came in, thanks to our Russian helpers. So then they lived through oppression until 1956, where I also, as an only child, escaped Budapest, Hungary, and came to the United States. And I'm not going to tell the whole story because it's very long, but I relate so much to you. But it was directly my parents and me coming through.
It was wonderful.
Something that I had not shared was the fact that it wasn't until the early 1980s a book came out, Children of Survivors, written by Helen Epstein. And it was a book that opened my eyes. Why? Because by the 1980s, I was already in my late 30s or early 40s. And it validated for me all of the feelings that I had inside of me that I thought were just unique to me as a child of survivors. And because unfortunately, a lot of the guilt that that my parents had until the day they died subliminally got transferred to me.
I so totally relate to that. I wouldn't even know where to begin to say it. I
mean,
must
my-
read them. I
my-
must read them.
My eyes are tearing up now. But thank you for sharing.
As somebody who had the pleasure of knowing Mike's parents and knowing Mike for almost 60 years, on the other hand, I'd like to say that Mike's parents created a wonderful family life for Michael, and they were fortunate to see grandchildren and great-grandchildren, or Ralph was. And as horrible as Ralph's experience is, when you met him and got to know him, he had a sense of humor, he was positive, and he worked very hard, but he worked very hard and seemed to enjoy what he did because he was creating for the next generation and helping the generations to come. So it wasn't all dark. There was a lot of life and hope and joy in Mike's parents' home and in their lives, and they given that spark to Michael and to the entire family.
This is Rabbi Richard Hammerman, who is my best friend and buddy. And yes, we've had known each other's families for decades, and I'm very, very pleased and proud to say that our children are our closest of friends to this day. Thank you, Richie.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I
yes.
want to tell you how touched I was that, you know, I mean, I was crying. I really am touched. It's just amazing, you know, how people manage to survive and go on with their lives. And you know, what happened to the Jewish people was a unique experience in mass murder, in that it was an attempt to eliminate an entire race. And the thing is that with other massacres, it's usually people are competing for the same land, the same amount of wealth, but this was totally different. This was a desire to eliminate a group of people, no matter where they were. And also the thing is that when Hitler was losing the war, they didn't stop exterminating Jews. That continued. Also, I did watch The World at War maybe about 20 years ago, and there were four sessions on the final solution. And there was one thing that I thought was interesting that I didn't know, that initially Hitler was trying to make a pure society, and he was eliminating and murdering Germans who were considered defective. And he stopped doing that. And the reason was because there were people, German people, who loved these defective Germans. And so because they protested, he stopped eliminating murdering defective Germans. But when it came to Jews, nobody really cared. And like when you showed, you know, that well-known, you know, statement, like how, you know, finally they came for me and nobody was left, you know, they came for this person, but it wasn't me. You know, this is, you know, it's just the Germans, you know, the group, they didn't care what happened to Jews as long as it wasn't done to them.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael. I was wondering, as part of the legacy for you, Michael, did that have your family history, did that have a bearing on you becoming a rabbi?
It's an interesting question that I've never been asked, and I'm not sure that I ever really gave thought to or connected the dots. I think that I was raised with a tremendous sense of Jewish consciousness and awareness, perhaps in part because of what happened to my grandparents and how I experienced it through the eyes of my parents. I think that my engagement as a rabbi was due in large measure of my trying to do whatever little I could to improve the world and make it a safer place for all humanity. So I don't know that I can draw a direct line. Rabbi Hammerman, who's still on this call, to his credit, together with his lovely Kala, Sharon, they were blessed with 3 children. One unfortunately passed away a year ago, but 2 of them went on to become rabbis. So there's no question in my mind that there was a direct connection between their choice of careers and their father being a rabbi.
Well, if there's no further questions, I would want to thank you again. Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead, Lenore.
Laura Livingston, a former member till last year of the congregation, and I live up here in New Jersey now, but and that's where I am. I wanted to comment, first of all, thank you, Michael. It was just a wonderful presentation. My own thoughts as a child, I'm in my 80s, but my thoughts of childhood, hello?
Yes, you're on.
We hear you.
Okay.
We hear you.
My picture came on. My grandparents all came from Europe, and they were the first of our families to be here. My parents were from this country. However, my grandparents had a lot of hesitation in many instances of talking about their past. I heard a lot of what you were saying, but not really in any large amount. My mother happened to say to me, they just don't like to talk about those days. I had certain visions from maybe being 4 and 5 years old of what some of their life was like. And their last name on my mother's family happened to be Geldzeiler, which my mother said translates as money counter. And she said there was absolutely nobody in the family who was involved in anything like that. So the stories that came down were minimal. And I always sort of, I guess it was the difficulty of life that kept them from talking about it. I don't know what they would have been afraid of here at the time, but maybe I'm just not, I was.
Well, I think the phenomenon that you're describing is almost universal. When you talk to people who are survivors, who have members of their family who were victims, more often than not, I believe the ones who survived wanted to go on with life and put behind them the memories, the scars, the emotional scars that they carried with them, or at least not wear them for all to see and to hear. And so I really knew very little about my grandparents. In fact, I would tell you that it wasn't until I was about 20 years old that the concept of a grandparent even meant something to me. I didn't know what a grandparent was. I know it sounds absurd and ridiculous, but it was an abstraction.
That's interesting.
I could
I
not.
can't see it, by the way, but
I couldn't relate to friends who talked about their grandparents, and so really it wasn't until the last decade or so that I started delving into this whole matter, because for me, believe it or not, dealing with these letters took a lot of emotional courage on my part. When my father died in 2006, it took me 10 years before I opened the one remaining box that he left behind, because I knew what was inside that box. I knew it was those letters that he had mentioned to me that he had kept, and I just couldn't deal with it. So I can understand how someone who survived, and my parents, thank God, they didn't suffer the indignities and the harm and you know, all of the horrific things that happened to Jews who ultimately were killed. They were spared that. But if they shared, if they were so upset and obsessed with those memories, it prevented them from being able to be verbal about them. And so it's not unusual, but thank you.
Rabbi, I have one question. It's amazing. One question. It's amazing that you have those letters. It's remarkable, from 1939 to 41. But what are you going to be doing with the letters? You're going to give it to your children, to a museum, or
Well,
did you photocopy them? Or?
They have been digitized, and they most likely will be given as a total collection, minus a couple of pages that each of my children will have. They'll be given to the Leo Beck Institute in New York, because the Leo Beck Institute, named for its the famous rabbi from Germany, Leo Beck, is the Center for the Study of Contemporary Jewry. And while the information that's disclosed in the letters is very pedestrian and nothing out of the ordinary, to a researcher, to a scholar who knows how to read between the lines, there may be things in these 400 pages that might prove of value for a future generation.
Interesting.
Thank you. Thank you again. This was just, as you can tell from the questions and the comments, a wonderful, touching presentation, as well as being historical, but also so heartfelt from you and your family.
Thank you.
So just to put a little plug in, please remember to go to Temple Beth David FL for Florida.org to check out all of Temple Beth David's adult education and scholar in resident offerings. Please note on your calendar that January 24th, it's a Sunday at 10 a.m., Israela Meyerstein, Michael's wonderful wife, will be making a presentation on Bridge to Healing about her personal journey and tools for resilience. So wishing you a wonderful day, a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you all again.